Today the first guest speaker is Gudbjörg Johannesdóttir, Kukka. She's coming from Iceland and she has a PhD in philosophy, and at the moment she is doing research and also teaching in two universities, right? The Academy of Arts and the University of Iceland. So she's embodying the combining the science and art, what we are seeking here. So she's going to talk about beauty, art and landscape from a phenomenological point of view, and after that we will have Jani Närhi over there, who is going to continue with paradise concept in different religions. I think we are ready to start, please.
Hello, nice to be here with you today. I want to start by telling you a little bit about the context, why I have been thinking so much about beauty for the last few years. And it's relating to the Icelandic landscape. When I came back from doing a master's degree in environmental philosophy in England in 2006, people were starting to do a landscape research project in relation to a master plan for the use of hydro and geothermal energy in Iceland. So they were had been kind of evaluating all the different values that natural areas can have, and make decisions about which areas to use for energy protection and energy production, and which areas to protect. And this work started, I think, in around 2000, but in 2006 they were first starting to think about landscape as one of the categories that needed to be talked about. And so they were starting with that project, and one of the persons who was doing that, he approached me and asked if I was interested in studying the concept of landscape from a philosophical perspective. And they were also talking to other students, for example in geography, and kind of wanting to understand the concept of landscape. Since they were going to research landscape and the value of landscape, they thought we need to understand what this concept means. So we need many different theoretical perspectives maybe to understand the meaning of the concept. So when I first started to think about that concept, it was in relation to that, and there was always this talk about the aesthetic value of landscape. That was what was supposed to be thought about. So there was always this connotation with the aesthetic. So what I decided to do was that I decided to study the experiences of landscape, because I thought, where the value must be coming from our experiences. So I studied both the kind of history of the concept and then also people's experiences of geothermal landscapes and of glacial landscapes. But the problem that I encountered was that because of this connotation with the aesthetic, and also because of kind of how we use the concept of landscape, there is always this idea of beauty. In Icelandic, the aesthetic or aesthetics is translated as fagurfræðilegt, and fagur means beauty, so it kind of means directly beauty or logical. So it's very obvious this, kind of connection always with the concept of beauty when you're talking about the aesthetic. But this was creating the problem, and this was maybe the reason why landscape had not been taken into account until then. Because this word aesthetic, and because of its relation to beauty, it was always understood as subjective and relative, personal, emotional. And this was creating the practical problem of, how do we deal with something that is not measurable? It's a personal, subjective value. So that was kind of the reason why it has been left out. And then there was also this understanding that the aesthetic was mostly related to the visual. But then there was also this feeling that it was more than that, which is kind of represented in the phrase that these professionals that were working for the master plan, when they were writing a report about what had to be studied more about landscape, they said we need to study the aesthetic, emotional and experiential value. So that was kind of showing what they were meaning by the aesthetic. They were meaning the emotional and experiential value of the landscape as well. So this is kind of the context, why I wanted to understand beauty and how it's something more than just a visual. But the concept has, it's kind of central. Concept of beauty is kind of central to how we commonly understand the aesthetic, and it's also been central to our philosophical understanding of what the aesthetic is. And in language, the words beauty and beautiful, they are more or less unaffected by philosophical critique of these themes, but yet they are clearly quite elusive and hard to define. This word beauty is so commonly used that everyone probably claims that they know what beauty is and they know what it means until they are asked to define it. So why is this concept so complicated in its simplicity? Is it because the experience of beauty, it seems so simple, just to be fascinated by the red color and sweet smell of a rose or the golden rays of a sunset by a glacier? Is it because this experience affects our consciousness in a complex and deep manner? Is the experience of beauty perhaps one of the most important pillars of human life? If so, then maybe it's not so surprising that defining the concept of beauty has proved to be so difficult. We have maybe here a similar situation as when we are dealing with God and the divine. Beauty and the aesthetic are names that we have given to certain distinctly human experiences that play an important part in creating the core of what it means to be human. But at the same time, these are experiences that are very difficult to express in clear and concise terms. So as is common with elusive concepts, the concept of beauty has been understood and misunderstood in many different ways through history. After having almost disappeared from 20th century aesthetics, many scholars have been trying to revive the concept of beauty and bring it back into focus in the last decades. Most of them have in common that they start their revival of beauty by tracing the traditional ideas of beauty that have led to these displacements in 20th century art discourses, where it has been rendered as a notion that is not any longer seen as the hallmark of the aesthetic. So what happened in the history of ideas of beauty and in our culture that made beauty appear as uninteresting and trivial both in art and in philosophy? The connection between beauty and ideas of embodiment and femininity in traditional and modern aesthetics play an important role in this development. These ideas have led to the situation that beauty has been devalued because of its relation to the body and the feminine in a philosophical era that has been permeated by a dualistic divide between body and soul, emotion and reason, beauty and the sublime, and feminine and masculine. But now, when we're trying to move beyond this dualistic way of thinking and undermine these traditional distinctions, possibilities open up for reconceptualizing beauty and the beautiful. According to the common account of beauty that I've been dealing with and trying to go beyond, beauty refers chiefly to the form and appearance of an object, and the experience of beauty should be distanced and disinterested. But the phenomenological account of beauty is very different. For the American phenomenologist Galen A. Johnson, who based his thinking about beauty on Merleau-Ponty's works, the concept of beauty does not only refer to form and other sensuous qualities like color or sound or smell, but it also refers to a certain relation between the subject and the object. And in this relation there is no distance, but rather a very much of a closeness and openness between the subject and object. When we experience beauty, we open ourselves up to the object in a unique way. So phenomenology of the aesthetic is thus necessarily based on an aesthetic desire for the beautiful. Even though Merleau-Ponty never wrote an explicit account of beauty or aesthetics, his ontology has an underlying aesthetic theory built into it, like Johnson has argued. And this is not surprising, since Merleau-Ponty's last ontological reflections on our relation to the world were largely based on his reflections on artists and their creative work. In Merleau-Ponty's view, there were some unique parallels in the ideas and attitudes found in modern art and in phenomenological thinking. In both disciplines, he saw the same kind of longing for paying more attention to the sensory and bodily experience that comes before conceptual knowledge and can be termed as pre-discursive. Our pre-discursive knowledge of reality is the bodily, affective, pre-symbolic experience that comes before words and that is routed through the logics of the body. Just like Cézanne tried to put on canvas his direct lived perception of the world, phenomenologists tried to describe this direct perception by bracketing the natural attitude that occupies itself with categorizing reality into separate parts. Merleau-Ponty thus thought that art is somehow better equipped than other disciplines to describe directly how we live in the world, how we experience the world and relate to it through our perception. In his paper called Eye and Mind, he claimed that art is in some way more capable than philosophy to perform the phenomenological reduction, to bracket the preconceived conceptual knowledge and focus on direct perception. The painter mediates her experience of reality directly through the body. In the painting, there are no words or concepts that get in the way. Instead of perceiving reality first through the body and then putting those perceptions into words and concepts, the artist mediates her perception directly through her eyes, hands, and senses. And it was this artistic process that Merleau-Ponty thought could enable him to understand deeper levels of perception by disclosing the intentional structures in relations to objects and others in the world. So the interrelationality of body and nature, as for example apparent in that our bodies come to be and grow and decay, this is for Merleau-Ponty a naturalistic basis for his undermining of the traditional distinction between the subject and the object. In his posthumous work, The Visible and the Invisible, where he directs his attention to the natural and corporeal world and the aesthetic perception of it, he introduces the concept of chair, or flesh. With this term, he aimed for nothing less than a new terminology that can allow us to speak of our relationship with the world without relying on this distinction between subject and object. He says there, the flesh is not matter. It is not a fact or a sum of facts, material or spiritual. nor is it a representation for a mind. The flesh is not matter, it is not mind, is not substance. To designate it, we would need the old term element, in the sense it was used to speak of water, air, earth and fire. That is, in the sense of a general thing, midway between the spatio-temporal individual and the idea, a sort of incarnate principle that brings a style of being wherever there is a fragment of being. The flesh is in this sense an element of being. Thus the perceiver and the perceived are both active parts of the same flesh. And he says there also, the body is a being of two leaves, from one side a thing among things, and otherwise what sees them and touches them. Its double belongingness to the order of the object and to the order of the subject reveals to us quite unexpected relations between the two orders. It cannot be incomprehensible accident that the body has this double reference. It teaches us that each calls for the other. So in order to be able to grasp the profound sense of beauty as experienced in natural landscapes, it is necessary to analyze it as an experience of the intertwining that is characteristic of the flesh. From a phenomenological point of view, beauty is not the quality of the object, but rather an experience that takes place in the intertwining of the object and the subject who perceives it. Beauty is thus one of the elements of flesh. Beauty is, like flesh, this strange place between the self and the world, between the self and the artwork or the self and nature. According to the widespread, narrow idea of beauty, the experience of beauty is distant and disinterested. The subject is somehow separated from the object and judges its form and content and the pleasure they evoke. But from the point of view of the ontology of flesh, this division between subject and object is not realistic. The meaning that the subject finds in the object, whether it is an aesthetic meaning or not, is always created between the subject and object, in the flesh that is this intertwining of the self and the world. One of the things that directed Merleau-Ponty's attention towards artists and their work was their idea that the world looks at them, that they listen to and receive some meaning that the mountain or the forest express to them. According to Johnson, this is precisely what characterizes the experience of beauty. It is no coincidence that we often speak of the love of art, the love of nature, and the love of another human being in a similar manner. All these types of love are somehow related to the love of beauty, and they encourage us to care for and protect those precious treasures that fill our lives with meaning. But why do we care about an artwork, or nature, or a human being? The root of our care lies in the fact that we see the artwork, nature, or the human being as an independent existence that brings meaning to us, looks at us, and speaks to us in some manner or the other. And this is the core of the phenomenological account of beauty. The experience of beauty involves opening oneself up to the other, and listen, see, and feel who the other really is, instead of throwing our own concepts and ideas on the object of beauty, and thereby striving towards controlling and owning it. In order to understand this opening up to the other that occurs in the aesthetic experience of beauty in landscape, it is useful to examine how Johnson uses Merleau-Ponty's idea of an aesthetic desire. For all of Merleau-Ponty's artists, the relation between beauty and desire was very strong. And for Merleau-Ponty himself, desire played an important part in all expression, whether it is artistic or not. A certain idea of desire has been advocated that holds that desire is negative, because it involves some aim to own and control and use the object. This idea has led to the exclusion of the relation between beauty and desire. Since beauty should be disinterested and distanced, there is no room for this negative desire that involves the interest of owning the object and this closeness the subject desires to have with the object. Merleau-Ponty's understanding of desire is completely different from this approach that has been prevalent in Western philosophy and is derived from the negative pole in the ambiguous conception of desire. Instead of the idea that aesthetic desire involves a desire to objectify or own the object, Merleau-Ponty's idea of aesthetic desire connects with a positive notion of desire that entails opening oneself up towards the object as it is. It involves an openness towards the other to receive the meaning that the other expresses. In this context, Johnson refers to Heidegger's idea of the experience of beauty, but he claimed that with the idea of disinterestedness, Immanuel Kant did not mean that the experience of beauty should be absolutely distant and free from any longing, but rather that such experience involves a certain attempt to let things be as they are. This letting be involves being open towards the object and relating to it, and this is the core of beauty. Beauty attracts us. It draws our consciousness towards itself and creates a desire for repetition and for sustaining and sharing beauty with others. Who hasn't had the experience of finding something beautiful and feeling the need to point it out to the next person? Or feeling the need to take a photo or draw a picture or make a poem or write music or just take it in for a long time. Just a need to capture the moment of beauty and create new beauty, continue it in some manner. Beauty nourishes the one who experiences it, and this nourishment encourages her to reciprocate, to protect and nourish this beauty so it may continue to nourish others. If our understanding of the concept of beauty is built on this type of desire of openness instead of a negative desire, a different picture appears of the experience of beauty and how it affects human life and awareness. This type of experience gives an opportunity to contemplate and dwell on the object. The experience of beauty begins in sensuous perception. The object of beauty, whether it is a form, color, texture, sound, movement, words, or actions, draws the senses towards itself, captures our attention. Often this happens in a quite unsuspected way. Beauty captures one's attention and pulls one's consciousness out of the everyday environment for a moment. Caught up in everyday thoughts, I look out the window and see 4 swans fly by in the pink morning light, and for a few moments my thoughts stop, and the only thing that fills my mind are the slow movements of the beautiful white wings. But often the experience of beauty is something that we seek out on purpose. At the art museum or in the theatre, in a natural landscape, or at home with a book in hand or music in our ears. And at these moments, we put ourselves in a special frame of mind and expect our attention to be captured. And we even get disappointed if we don't succeed in leaving daily life behind and don't get enough chance to enjoy. When one's attention has been captured, the desire for repetition comes along. I watch the swans until they go out of sight and feel the need to capture the moment and find a way of sharing it somehow. This desire for repetition can also be seen as a desire for dwelling in the moment, a longing to continue to watch and letting the object influence our being. Philosophers have often described beauty as something that greets you. And Elaine Scully, she points out that not Homer alone, but Plato, Aquinas, Plotinus, Zeno, Dionysius, Dante, and many others repeatedly describe beauty as a greeting. At the moment one comes into the presence of something beautiful, it greets you. It lifts away from the neutral background as though coming forward to welcome you, as though the object were designed to fit your perception. So beauty is a call. It calls for my attention, and when my attention heeds the call, beauty welcomes me and gives me access to its object. Beauty resonates with something in me that is open to letting it overtake me in a sense, as if I was momentarily off guard. In his essay on walking up the mountain, Petrarca has to remind himself not to revel too much in the beauty of the landscape, because it may, according to the Christian morals of medieval times, distract him from thinking of God. What is implied here, among other things, is an acknowledgement of the fact that a beautiful landscape can make one forget not only the Creator, but also forget oneself in a certain way. And this is an important reason for seeking such experiences. They give us a sense of relief from mundane thoughts and everyday worries. An essential part of this experience of opening oneself up for and dwelling in the moment of beauty is a radical decentering of the experiencing subject. And Scarry illustrates this with a description that she takes from Simone Weil. At the moment we see something beautiful, we undergo a radical decentering. Beauty, according to Simone Weil, requires us to give up our imaginary position at the center. When we come upon beautiful things, they act like small tears in the surface of the world that pulls us through to some vaster space, or they lift us, as though by the air currents of someone else's sweeping, letting the ground rotate beneath us several inches, so that when we land, we find we are standing in different relation to the world than we were a moment before. It is not that we cease to stand at the center of the world, for we never stood there. It is that we cease to stand even at the center of our own world. We willingly cede our ground to the thing that stands before us. When this radical decentering or unselfing takes place, we gain a different kind of access to the world, to what we perceive. Instead of the I being in the center, the being of what is perceived, independent of all my interests and longings, becomes the center of attention. There is a sense of unrestraint in such an experience that gives space for disclosure to happen. The result of this is that something is opened up for us that we have no better way of describing it than to say, oh, how beautiful. This allows us to understand more clearly Heidegger's account of disinterestedness as letting be, as an openness of the subject and the object. So what I am referring to here as beauty begins in simple perception, but when everything is counted, it is much more than that. And perhaps simple perception is also something much more than we normally think it is. The experience of beauty gives us an important lesson in putting our own self to the side. Such an experience entails transcending our narrow interests, altering our preconceived ideas, and perceiving things in some new way, and most likely not as we expect them to be. So there is a transformative moment to the experience of beauty. One's own ideas are modified or enriched when seeing something new or something we already know in a different light. And the important thing is that this radical decentering that takes place in the experience of beauty leads to pleasure. So an individual that has once been captured by beauty is likely to look for opportunities to repeat this experience. Thus, the longing for beauty becomes a capability that is cultivated and inspired by each individual's experience. So if the core of our understanding of beauty becomes relational, how does our understanding of the aesthetic change? According to the phenomenological interpretations of beauty that I've been discussing, the concept of the beautiful does not refer either to physical objective qualities or to the subjective experiences of a detached mind. They refer to the most immediate and direct relations we have with the world and to ourselves via the world. If we apply this relational thought to the aesthetic, we reach a point where the original meaning of the Greek word aesthesis becomes central again in our understanding of the aesthetic. The sphere of aesthesis, or the field of the sensuous, marks the realm in which aesthetics as a traditional discipline meets phenomenology. And as Embry and Rainer Sepp point out, this is a meeting in which aesthetics has changed and phenomenology has expanded its framework. The connection between aesthetics and phenomenology has often been pointed out. As I already noted, this is what Merleau-Ponty referred to in his writings about Cézanne and other artists. Cézanne's aesthetic approach, perceiving just to perceive and trying to capture on canvas some sort of direct perception of the world, is a case in point for the phenomenological approach. And Embry and Rainer Sepp furthermore point out that, quote, phenomenology has long and deeply dealt with aesthetics, unquote. This is perhaps unavoidable, since these disciplines share two of their central ideas, the emphasis on bracketing all preconceived ideas and opinions, and the emphasis on perception. So this connection between phenomenology and the aesthetic unveils how an aesthetic approach to reality can be seen as a form of the phenomenological reduction. In the moment we experience beauty, all our senses are so engaged with the object that all our preconceived opinions and ideas fall into the background. Our direct perception becomes the only focus, and thus we can see, hear, feel who or what the other is, instead of throwing our own ideas, interests, and concepts over it. In Arnold Berliand's view, aesthetic perception is a perceptual experience that needs to be recognized as, quote, the clearest measure by which to assess the values that emerge. Aesthetic perception may indeed stand as the touchstone of human values, unquote. This means that this type of human experience gives us access to perceive the world and ourselves as a part of an interdependent system. It is one thing to know things scientifically through scientific ideas and concepts, but another thing is to perceive, to know through the senses as embodied beings. So understanding landscape, beauty, and the aesthetic from these phenomenological perspectives, we can see that there is much more involved in the aesthetic value of landscape than a distant appreciation of physical objective qualities such as form and color. If beauty is about relation and opening up to the other, the aesthetic realm can be found when we open up to experience objects or environments in a manner that is fully aware of their perceptual richness and in which immediate qualitative perception dominates. The aesthetic experience of beauty thus can become a deep experience that not only gives us pleasure, but also helps us better understand our place in the world and our relations to the environments we dwell in. The moment of experiencing beauty, where one's perceptual attention is drawn towards the other, provides the possibility of experiencing through our embodied being our relation with the environment that we are always inherently a part of. And this is a form of self-knowledge that is urgently needed today. We have had the ecological understanding of a place of humans in nature for a long time, but this knowledge has not yet hit home, in a way. For that to happen, we need to have the possibility of a direct perceptual experience of being a part of nature's ecological system. And that is where aesthetic, embodied experiences of natural landscapes play a key role. Experiences of standing in relation to the environment and to other living beings reveal an idea of the subject as an embodied, relational, environmental self that is not detached from, but immersed in the environment. So providing more scientific books, information and evidence about global environmental change does not alone seem to be able to make us grasp the knowledge that we need to take to heart if we are to avert the ecological crisis we are facing. As our knowledge of the human influence on the natural world has increased, we are realizing the enormous scale of this influence that has been described in terms of a new geological age called the Anthropocene. However, this realization has not yet led to the dramatic changes that are needed in policy making and in people's behavior and attitudes towards nature. This is why issues regarding the global environmental change we are going through have to be reframed as not only environmental scientific challenges, but as human and social challenges. In order to deal with such challenges, we need to understand the roles of culture, values and behavior in environmental change. We need to transform our societies and question deeply held values and assumptions about our place in the natural world. Reflecting on the aesthetic experience of landscape helps us question some of the most deeply held assumptions that we have about the self and about the ways we find meaning and value in the world. Landscape is a multi-layered concept that includes both the visible and the invisible relationships which emerge in people's actions, movements, speech, thoughts, imaginations, and narratives that are intertwined with the visual. If landscape is viewed from this relational perspective, we can see how it adds to our usage of the concepts of nature and culture and bridges the gap we often create between them. Landscape involves a comprehensive way of looking at the reality of places and spaces. Instead of dividing reality into different boxes and viewing nature in one box and culture in another, the landscape concept invites us to look at the whole picture, how the meaning of landscape emerges in the relation between subject and object, between the human and the land. So taking the value of landscape into account in decision-making thus requires creating a space where this relation can be expressed, shared and deliberated. So it requires a space for increased public participation. We have been using the concepts and methods of the natural and mathematical sciences to evaluate the natural world for the last decades, determining the value of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and hoping that these methods will create a solid grounding for good decision-making. But although such methods can be helpful, they will never be able to capture the environmental values that are most important to us. These methods involve approaching the environment as a list of separated objects, where the relations between us and these objects, beings and environments are neglected. Thus, the systems that we currently use to deal with environmental decision-making are too reductionistic. They are not able to account for how relations, time and history create the meaning and value we find both in natural and cultural landscapes. We find value in the story of the landscape, whether it is the story of human actions or the biological or geological story of the actions of natural forces. So the landscape concept, that, in this understanding that I have been discussing, can become a tool in decision-making that reveals these stories and relations, and thus provides a fuller account of environmental values than the calculated methods of economics and the natural sciences. Instead of itemizing and separating valuable objects, the landscape concept allows for a more holistic approach as landscape includes all the different layers of stories that contribute to our aesthetic perception of it. First, there is the geological story that can be told by the geologist and by the people that have experienced the influence of geological events like volcanic eruptions, melting glaciers and earthquakes. Secondly, there is the vegetation side of the story told by the biologist or the farmer. Thirdly, the archaeological and anthropological stories of human settlement and development in the landscape. And finally, the stories of people who live and dwell in the land and relate to it through their experiences, memories, stories, writings, literature and art. These stories must all be heard in decision-making. So taking the value of landscape into account means changing the way we frame the human-nature relationship in our systems of decision-making. Instead of seeing ourselves as separated subjects that measure, count and control the object of nature, the landscape concept allows us to see how there is no separation between humans and nature, subject and object. It allows us to express and deliberate the human-nature relations that are revealed in aesthetic experiences of landscape. These are meaningful relations that are based on a certain kind of love of nature and feeling connected to it. Meaningful relations are like relations of love and friendship, based on the deep aesthetic of letting be and perceiving what or who one loves or relates to as an independent other. Finding beauty in the other in this deep and rich way, which allows one to open up to the other, is thus a key to forming meaningful relations. If our aim is to transform our societies and question deeply held values and assumptions about our place in the natural world, these are the types of human-nature relations that we need to create a space for in our deliberations and decision-making processes. Thank you.